One cold February day in Michigan, Stephen Kubacki, a bright and adventurous student at Hope College in Michigan State, decided to go on a solo cross-country skiing trip near Lake Michigan. Being in the middle of winter, the lake was frozen, though being a great lake, the ice was uneven and not flat like a small lake would be. For some reason, Stephen decided to cast off his backpack and skis, and he walked out onto the ice. His tracks were later found, walking out onto the ice, where they suddenly stopped. The discovery was made after he had been missing for days, and search teams deployed. For 14 months he had seemed to have vanished, only to turn up under a tree in Massachusetts, and the frozen lake seemed like moments ago. Stephen Kubacki left his skis and backpack on the shore and walked onto the ice. His tracks led to a point on the ice where they just stopped. There was no sign of any struggle, no sign of cracking of the ice or any other person's tracks, nor did his tracks lead anywhere else. He basically just vanished from that point. The only physical way he could have left on his own accord is by carefully stepping back into his own footprints to conceal his retreat. A highly unlikely event, and would probably have shown up in the tracks themselves. Stephen, before this event, had been finishing his final semester at Hope College. He had 3 courses left. He was 23 years old and an experienced cross-country skier. He had been skiing since he was 17 and both skied and hiked some of the tallest mountains in Europe. That day, Stephen told his roommate that he was going to ski down to the lake and ski his way back home. When he didn't return the next day, his roommate didn't really think anything of it, and it wasn't until the following day that he started to get concerned that something may have been wrong. They reported Stephen missing to the police, and back in 1978, this was met with a "so what" attitude, that adults were allowed to go off on their own and go missing if they want. And that attitude all changed when some people came across Stephen's backpack and skis on the shore of Lake Michigan, with one pair of tracks going off into the lake. The behavior of walking out onto the frozen lake was not an odd thing for him to do, however. Stephen leaving his skis and backpack behind was odd for him, his brother claiming that Stephen would have never done that. The tracks went out about 200 yards from the shore where they abruptly stopped. The search for him began with a team of dogs, snowmobiles, a helicopter, and a plane to scour the nearby area. Being that the tracks stopped, there was no reason to look too far around the area. After the search coming up empty, the officials decided to call off the search, and the conclusion that was come up with is that Stephen must have stepped into a thin piece of ice, fell in, and died, with the ice covering it back up, leaving no trace. Which is probably the logical conclusion one would make in this situation. Stephen's family refused to believe he was dead, even after time went on. His college ended up giving him an honorary degree. Months went by. Months turned into seasons, with no sign of Stephen. It wasn't until spring in 1979, 14 months from his disappearance, that Stephen suddenly showed up at his aunt's door and knocked. Shocked and awed by Stephen's appearance, his family asked where he'd been and what had happened. According to Stephen, he woke up under a tree in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. In a confused state, he walked over to nearby people and asked what the date was and where he was. He didn't remember what had happened to him, but he did try to remember, and his last memory, which seemed to be very recent to him, was that he was on the ice. He remembers standing on the ice, and then next thing he knew, he woke up on that grassy knoll, under a tree, in another state, in the middle of spring, wearing clothes that were not his. Stephen was completely unaware that 14 months had passed until he picked up a newspaper and saw the date. He did not remember any events since the lake, to waking up. But he did have a backpack with him. Inside this backpack was a shirt from a Wisconsin marathon, running shoes, and a map of California. There were also signs that alluded to him hitchhiking. Again, he had no memory of this. He did say he felt like he had done a lot of running, but that was the extent of his recollections of the past 14 months. Now, going off the contents in the bag, it looks like Stephen had somehow gotten off the lake without leaving any tracks and started to hitchhike without his backpack and skis, going to California, back to Wisconsin, racing in a marathon, and hitchhiked to Massachusetts. If he did do all these things and didn't remember them, then he would have amnesia. The strange thing about Stephen is that he had no ambition to actually try and figure out what he was up to. If it was me, I would certainly be bothered and would like to have figured out what it was I was doing. For just the fact I couldn't remember would bother me. But Stephen just went back to college, back to his normal life like nothing had happened. Now this is the interesting part, because we don't know he did all these things. We don't know that this was his backpack. We don't know that he didn't get that backpack from someone else. We can infer with a very high probability that these were his, that somehow he did all these things without remembering. But we don't know this for sure. We also still don't know just how he got off that ice sheet without leaving tracks. Now this tale comes from the famous Missing 411 people accounts. One of the stories has been accumulating over the years, and it's an especially odd one with the time gap and the footprints. The show Ancient Aliens even did a piece on this, that he stepped through a portal, and others claim he may have been abducted by UFOs. The other explanation is something called a fugue state, or disassociated fugue state. In a fugue state, often people will have their personalities change, wander off, and often assume a new identity that sometimes can last a few months. The people who have these happen to them will have amnesia, with sometimes vague memories of some events. Now, the issue with this seemingly more reasonable explanation, people who have these fugue states are people often with split personalities or suffer trauma. There's no sign of either in Stephen, and from what we know, this hasn't happened to him since. While a fugue state is the more reasonable explanation, it doesn't completely fit. While it will be satisfactory for most people to accept so they can feel safe in their materialistic world that nothing too strange really ever happens. But some of us are left to question the other possibilities. And I bring this up in the sense of time travel because, as I have already done a video on the grandfather paradox, and pointing out how it isn't really a paradox, even I wasn't completely sold on my own arguments. But I also have a channel called There Are No Paradoxes, and I mean this because paradoxes exist. But they also are resolved, because nature is itself a paradox. They both exist and don't exist. And this is the resolution. But in this case, we can look at a fresh idea on how to resolve the grandfather paradox, one that I'm pretty sure has not been entertained, and that deals with memory and memory loss. Stephen Hawking famously set up an invitation to a party for all time travelers to show up. When they didn't, Stephen gloated about how silly it was to think that there were active time travelers. Now, let's remove the obvious fallacy to his party trick, one that time travelers would probably not go to a party to a famous scientist and out themselves as time travelers. Also, let's remove all my other arguments about the special fallacy, i.e. that if you travel back in time but do not account for the Earth and solar system to be millions of miles away from your location, and you go back to empty space. So in this case, let's assume that time travel is possible, and you can be tethered to the Earth so that its location in space is irrelevant. Well, in order to get around the grandfather paradox, the path of least resistance in this case would be to wipe the traveler's memory upon entering of the destination. For example, you want to go back and take out Hitler, so you go back in time, but as soon as you end up in the 30s, boom, your memory's gone. You're a lone weirdo who doesn't know where they are, what year it is, or what you're doing, where you are. Suddenly you wouldn't be able to carry out your mission, and would have virtually no way to ever be able to take out your own grandfather, keeping your existence insured. If time travel is possible, we still don't have a good idea of what consciousness is, at least on the materialist version of reality. We don't know how the human brain would be able to deal with such an extreme event like transporting yourself instantly into another time and place. We don't know what that would do to your consciousness or memory. There could be literally thousands of time travelers out there right now, completely out of it, lost and confused. If this were the case, we might look at homeless people who seem lost and confused a little bit differently. Also, if this is a condition of time travel, it may have been tried a few times and abandoned for this reason. It's completely ineffective if the target forgets who and why he is in the past or future. In the case of Stephen Kubacki, he may have had a time slip. He may have existed in more than one realm of existence. Maybe his body and subconscious was here in this one, while his consciousness was somewhere else. Or maybe he got sucked into a portal, one that did rip him off the ice and sent him into the future, a future that he cannot remember. But without his memory, we may never know. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out a small channel like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.